Good dog. Good afternoon. We have another, I think, a really exciting spennende paper. Eric Moe, who I've just had the pleasure to meet, he's from the University of Washington. I think you should give him a hand. He just completed his MA at the University of Washington a week ago. And because he's completely burned out on the academic world, he's going to spend a year in Norway next year, going to a folk high school. So I don't blame him, I understand. And you know, I hope he has a wonderful time over there and gets to enjoy all the pleasantries of Norway. Eric's going to be talking about the 1925 Norse-American Centennial, which is the subject of his master's thesis. And today he's going to focus on how the theory of whiteness can be applied to this event and will help us to better understand what was going on. So I want to turn it over to Eric. Why don't you give him another big hand, and this will be fun to listen to.
Thank you, Daron, and I hope the clicker works. I didn't test this beforehand. Yes, hello. My name is Eric Moe. I am a master's student from the University of Washington and wrote my thesis on the 1925 Norse-American Centennial and the performativity of whiteness. To give a quick rundown, oh no, it's not on, that's why, right?
While you're waiting, I also forgot to mention that Eric is a graduate of Olaf College as well, so he's done a lot in his young life.
Oh no. Oh, I don't know. Technology problems. The big blue one. Okay, there we go. Technology solved. Yes. To give a quick rundown of my 40 to 45 minute presentation, we'll see. I will start with an introduction to the Centennial, who I am and my topic and how I came to discover the Centennial. Specific definitions, specifically of what is whiteness, what is performance, what is Norwegian-American identity, and what is Nordic whiteness. And now looking at one of the key themes for my thesis, that being the Vikings, Leif Erikson, and the discovery of America, and ending with a small conclusion of what can we learn from the Centennial as we now celebrate or commemorate the Bicentennial. So to go over the introduction. In 1825, Norwegian Quakers, led by Kleng Pearson, sailed from Norway on the Restaurasjon, a small sloop holding 52 passengers as they crossed the Atlantic. The members of the ship were later called sloopers and are now regarded as starting the first major wave of migration from Norway to the United States. 100 years later, in 1925, at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds in the Twin Cities, Norwegian-Americans and other festival goers gathered from June 6th to June 9th to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the crossing of the Restaurasjon. This celebration, titled the Norse-American Centennial, was intended to celebrate the sloopers, Norwegian-Americans, and Norwegian-American identity. Many different speeches, services, exhibits, and musical performances entertained celebration goers, both in English and Norwegian. Speeches and events were hosted by prominent members of various Norwegian-American institutions with various roles, such as scholars Ole Rolvag, Rasmus B. Andersen, and Olaf Morgan Norli, religious representatives such as, oh, I'm behind. It's taking a minute. There we go. I think I have to point it that way. Maybe, there we go. Religious representatives such as Bishop Johan Peter Lunde, musical performance. Technology is going to be the downfall. Musical performances from the St. Olaf Choir and the Luther College Band, and political representatives. It's going to be a constant struggle. and political representatives, including Minnesota Governor Theodore Christensen, Congressman O.J. Kvale, and Senator Peter Norbeck. In addition, commemorative medals and stamps were produced for the Centennial, certified by Congress. There was a massive 1,500-person pageant performed named Pageant of the Northmen, which sought to retell the history of Norwegian immigration to the Midwest and to reenact the story of Colonel Hans Hegg, a Norwegian-American who fought in the Civil War. The keynote speech and a major point of attraction was not given by a member of the Norwegian-American community, but rather by President Calvin Coolidge. While the Centennial was intended to be a celebration of the sloopers and Norwegian-American identity, the inclusion and prevalence of non-Norwegian-American participants and a major focus on becoming Americans by the Norwegian-American members meant that the 1925 Centennial also functioned as Norwegian-American assimilation into the realm of American whiteness. Before diving deeper into the performativity of whiteness, it is important to mention how I came to be interested in the Centennial and its connection to whiteness. In August 2022, I started research on the 1925 Norse-American Centennial as an undergraduate research intern for the Norwegian-American Historical Association, located right here on campus, which was founded shortly after the Centennial. The bulk of this research task was to read through primary materials collected and digitized by NAHA in order to build a website highlighting key events and ideas from 1925. Throughout this month, another intern and I began to work through the thousands of digitized letters, correspondences, records, clippings, posters, and films in NAHA's archive, in addition to reading secondary scholarship focused on the Centennial. This month-long endeavor was a wonderful experience, and both the archival material and secondary scholarships, such as Ethnicity on Parade by April Schultz and the anthology Nordic Whiteness and Migration to the United States, raised numerous questions for me about the 1925 Centennial, whiteness, and Norwegian-American identity. These two books, in addition to other scholarly works, function as a guide to the source materials, and it made it easier to understand the claims and actions of the Centennial Committee, authors, and attendees. Questions about myth-making, what constitutes Norwegian-American identity, and what was actually being celebrated in 1925 stuck with me, particularly as I am a member of the Norwegian-American community, and my family has proudly attended Sons of Norway meetings for years. 2 months after my internship at NAHA, these questions reappeared in another context, as I received the honor of presenting my research. Hold for dramatic effect. My research to Queen Sonja of Norway at St. Olaf. During my 3-minute presentation, she asked me about the festivities taking place in 1925, asking, "Hvordan skal vi feire i 2025?" or "How will we celebrate in 2025?" At the time, I did not have a solid response, and this question surrounding 2025 remained an open question throughout my thesis, as do the questions surrounding Norwegian-American identity and whiteness. And here we are in 2025, commemorating the Bicentennial with these questions still open for discussion. My presentation and my thesis focuses on Norwegian-American ethnic identity assimilating into a racialized white American identity. While there may be some resistance in the Norwegian-American community to the ideas that Norwegian-American identity can be connected with white supremacy and anything but innocent, various scholars have written on this connection. For example, this technology is very fussy. There we go. In Writing Beyond Race, for example, Bell Hooks states, white supremacist thinking continues to be the invisible glue that keeps white folks connected irrespective of many other differences. Politically, white supremacist thinking was created to serve this purpose. White folks from all places and classes, speaking all manners of languages, migrated here in the hopes of creating a better, more prosperous, freer life for themselves. They, for the most part, collectively accepted a national identity based on the fictions of race and racism created by white supremacist thought and action. An ironic obscurity of whiteness is referenced in this quote, as Hooks highlights the visible and invisible aspects of white supremacy and the duality of migration to the US. The irony stems from how apparent these ideas and examples are, despite white supremacy attempting to remain undetected. The goal of white supremacy is to maintain the invisible glue among the accepted white community, despite the differences among them. This is where my positionality as a member of the Norwegian-American community comes into play, as I had never seriously considered how my ethnicity might be impacted in and actively constructed in relation to white supremacy until I spent time in the archive with this celebration. In the archive, the centennial and my positionality as a Norwegian-American became more complicated and less innocent. Significantly, Hooks notes that different groups, such as Norwegian Americans, did not migrate because of any connection to national identity, but instead because they wanted a better life for themselves and their families, a seemingly innocent narrative. Yet by proclaiming themselves to be Americans, they obtained access to the realm of national identity and white supremacy. This intersection is featured within the archive as members attending the Centennial had a unique claim to a certain kind of whiteness that other non-white ethnic groups did not. Yet they also had to exert a lot of effort to access this power. The refusal to acknowledge or ignorance towards white supremacy is certainly noticeable within markers and myths of Norwegian American identity. For myths of the Vikings' descendancy and migration to the United States as a neutral colonizing act, these recurring themes all connect to white privilege and white supremacy. These ideas are often clearly seen as culminating in one important moment, the 1925 Norse-American Centennial. Since my time as an intern at NAHA, one clear trend has emerged when thinking about and discussing the 1925 Centennial, the performance of whiteness. Whiteness is a performance, that is, the act of bringing into being a white identity, was central to the Norwegian American community in 1925 in order to gain access to the realm of white American privilege. Although explicit references to the word white during the Centennial are scarce, there are implicit and obscured references to whiteness evident through the essays, speeches, and installations of the Centennial. Due to this performance of whiteness and obscured acceptance of white supremacy, it is difficult to celebrate Norwegian American identity without tacitly accepting and promoting these ideas. Takes 3 clicks, I guess. Throughout my thesis and in this presentation, I refer to the performance of whiteness during the 1925 Norse-American Centennial. In this section, I will define what I mean when I use these words and how they affect my understanding of this topic. To start with the definition of whiteness, I will look at a historical example from around the time of the 1925 Centennial in W.E.B. Du Bois's Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, followed by a contemporary example from Noel Ignatiev's How the Irish Became White, before ending with my own interpretation. Starting with Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, from 1920, W.B. Du Bois interrogates questions of race, class, and gender in the US during the early 20th century. In his second chapter, The Souls of White Folk, Du Bois delves into the idea of whiteness in an attempt to understand it. He explicitly asks the question, but what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it? Immediately after, his answer is, then always, somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. To Du Bois, whiteness is ownership and control over everything, and the idea of control is central. Whiteness expands as far as it is allowed to by those who fall within its definition. In addition to this, Du Bois argues that personal whiteness is a modern concept, not something from the ancient world. With the ability to desire whiteness, Du Bois implies that an ethnic group can become white and enter into this realm of power, such as when an ethnic community seeks further recognition and support from the already accepted white American community. This definition also shows that Hooks' understanding of whiteness is not a new concept. Instead, the idea that whiteness is rooted in power and control is well established. As his scholarship from Du Bois was published 5 years before the Centennial, it acts as an account of one idea of whiteness around the same time period and provides necessary historical context for the Centennial. In How the Irish Became White from 1995, Noel Ignatieff highlights the creation of a white American ethnic identity, albeit while focusing on another ethnic group, the Irish. In the introduction, Ignatieff asks, what did it mean to the Irish to become white in America? To which he responds, to both Irish laborers and entrepreneurs, it meant that they were citizens of a democratic republic, with the right to elect and be elected and to spend, without racially imposed restrictions, whatever money they managed to acquire. In becoming white, the Irish ceased to be green. According to Ignatieff, functioning as white Americans meant that the Irish were able to participate in an idealized version of freedom for them, where they could vote and be elected and spend money where they choose to. In other words, as white Americans, they had privileges reserved only for Americans who were considered white. Yet in becoming white, the Irish also had to stop being considered Irish and instead become Americans. Ignatieff's definition works in congruence with the definitions provided by Du Bois and Hooks. While Du Bois focuses on power relations and control, and Hooks on the invisibility of white supremacy, Ignatieff includes privilege and loss of ethnic specificity as key aspects of whiteness. While some aspects of ethnic identity may have been preserved, the community could function and was accepted as being white Americans. These definitions can function as a starting point for discussing whiteness during the 1925 Centennial. Based on my readings of Du Bois, Ignatieff, and Hooks, whiteness is the method and actions, often implicit, of gaining access to white privilege and upholding white supremacy. Whiteness isn't simply something one inherits, rather it must be claimed and created. This idea of whiteness is seen through the 1925 Centennial, particularly in the celebration as the moment of performing the Norwegian-American community as fully white Americans. Significantly, this idea of whiteness, white supremacy, and access to power was common in the early 20th century. For example, one of the most influential texts around race at the time was Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race from 1916. Grant argues for the superiority of the Nordic race and the threat of immigration from outside of Northern Europe. His influence on discussions of race and ethnic identity were extremely popular, going so far as to influence public policy, such as the 1924 Immigration Act signed by President Calvin Coolidge. Reading through the essay contest in Coolidge's speech in particular, this idea of whiteness connected to privilege and supremacy is pertinent and acts as the method for Norwegian Americans becoming the correct version of red, white, and blue. Given this definition of whiteness, the construction and process of becoming white is important to discuss, especially because I argue the performance of whiteness was a major purpose and outcome of the Centennial. When I use performance, I mean the words and actions used to construct and proclaim Norwegian American identity as a white American identity throughout the 1925 Centennial. This understanding of performance is connected to J.L. Austin's definition of performativity. By saying that something is one way or another, it can become so, given the right conditions. In How to Do Things with Words, editors Umson and Spisa compiled various lectures given by Austin, particularly on the subject of performativity. In Lecture 1, Austin defines what it means to perform and how one can perform with words. I propose to call these sentences or utterances a performative sentence or a performative utterance, or for short, a performative. The term performative will be used in a variety of cognate ways and constructions, much as the term imperative is. The name is derived, of course, from perform, the usual verb with the noun action. It indicates that the issuing of the utterance is the performing of an action. It is not normally thought of as just saying something. By uttering something such as statements like, I name, or I bet, one does not simply describe, but rather does. This kind of speech, or utterance, is seen throughout the Centennial essay contest in Coolidge's speech. By proclaiming that Norwegian Americans are Americans, it is not simply describing the community as Americans, but rather performing the action, making them Americans. Through this definition, they become the right kind of Americans. They become white, in the sense defined by Du Bois. Another scholarly work that features an idea of performance, specifically through celebration, is Destination Culture by Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimblett. In Destination Culture, Kirschenbach-Gimblett explores the idea of performance through the ethnographic lens of the festival. The festival, both as it occurs locally and as an anthology of ethnographic displays, can be seen as a form of environmental performance. Arts festivals are generally less didactic and less textual than museum exhibitions. They depend more on performance, reserving extended textual analysis to the degree that is offered for the program booklet. In this way, avoiding the awkwardness of discoursing about living people in their very presence. Festivals are cultural performances par excellence. Their boundaries discernible in time and space. They are particularly amenable to encapsulation. Kirschenbach-Gimblett is arguing that festivals are more invested in performance than museum exhibitions, where visitors can experience and interact with a concentrated cultural identity. Objects and exhibits within a museum are often stagnant, leading to a sense of preservation, while celebrating during a festival leads to a sense of activeness, as the culture is alive and able to be produced in the current moment. Kirschenbach-Gimlet also argues that textual elements are often limited in the performance of the festival, except for supplementary materials such as programs. An example of the non-textual is Calvin Coolidge performing his speech live during the Centennial. While there is a silent recording of his speech, this is also supplemented by the archived version of his speech, which allows for study after the initial performance. Kirschenbach-Gimblet's definition of the festival as an environmental performance holds true from the 1925 Norse-American Centennial. Norwegian-Americans in 1925 were not a stagnant community or an object in a museum. They were an active community performing the Centennial to celebrate Norwegian migration to the United States and to perform their own whiteness. The Performativity Festival allows for physical and temporal boundaries to become focused, with a heightened emphasis on remembering 1825 and the crossing of the Restauration, and performing Norwegian-American identity as white in 1925. The 1925 Centennial highlights a moment in time in which festival goers were able to interact with and visualize Norwegian-American identity with non-textual features, such as exhibiting artifacts from the Norwegian-American community or listening to speeches by important members, in addition to taking part in the event of the essay contest. By including definitions of performance from Austin and Kirschenbach-Gimlet, I aim to clarify why I approach Coolidge's speech and essays from the contest as textual traces of the performance of whiteness, or as archived materials through which their contemporary thoughts and ideas about Norwegian-Americanness can once again be brought to light. Another important idea is the construction of a Norwegian-American ethnic identity, as the idea of the Norwegian-American community becoming white Americans requires this definition. While there are numerous scholars that have written about building European ethnic identities, Schultz's Ethnicity on Parade primarily focuses on the construction of Norwegian-American ethnicity and argues that the Centennial provided a stage for debating Norwegian-American identity between different fractions to construct a unified identity. An example of this debate included whether to maintain more Norwegianness in their identity, such as primarily using the language in schools and at church, or accommodating the already accepted American community and use English. In her introduction, Schultz writes, "Out of the great tensions, conflicts, and negotiations over what it meant to be a Norwegian American amidst the politics of Americanization and nativism, Centennial organizers and participants arbitrated a complex cultural identity. From such a vantage point, ethnicity is not inherent, but is constructed as a dialogue between immigrants and dominant society. It is not something to be preserved or lost, but rather is a process of identification at a particular moment to cope with historical realities." Schultz uses the 1925 Centennial to argue that ethnicity is not innate nor a fixed marker, but is instead constructed through compromise, identity markers, discussions, and claims. These claims are aptly illustrated by the 1925 Centennial, as the organizers had to navigate a post-war America in the political sphere of identity, particularly a push towards Americanization and nativism, or an assimilation of different ethnic Americans into a singular entity of American. During the aftermath of World War I, there was an intense focus throughout the United States placed on different ethnic identity groups to assimilate into this singular American identity. In response, a delicate balance between becoming Americans and celebrating Norwegian identity took place. Schultz's work argues for the construction and performance of Norwegian-American identity, similarly to this, and is a major inspiration, as her argument centers around identity as a process of becoming rather than a stagnant, immovable idea. This argument is further supported by Odd Levold in his 1998 book, The Promise Fulfilled, where he focuses on Norwegian-American ethnic identity and its current state. When referring back to the Centennial and its aftermath, Levold states, "For Norwegian Americans, the Viking image and the president's testimonial to the virility and adventurous spirit of an ethnic group with ancient Norse roots, rural values, and good American ideals became significant components of a dynamic process of self-definition. This creative and inventive process of defining the cultural and historical content of their ethnicity became essentially a question of both accommodation and resistance to assimilative forces in the historical context of the 1920s, rather than a recreation of an authentic Norwegian cultural heritage." Lavoll points to the importance of references to the Vikings and Coolidge's speech during the Centennial as integral parts of the construction of Norwegian-American identity. The dynamic process of self-definition refers to the debate about ethnic identity and what was being celebrated in 1925, and how the community sought to be considered true Americans, while simultaneously wanting to maintain their connection to Norway. Creating and inventing a Norwegian-American ethnic identity was important to the community, as it allowed them to navigate both worlds, acting as both patriotic Americans and maintaining connections to their home country. Yet, given the need to occupy a space between accommodation and assimilation, it was an invented idea of identity rather than being fully rooted in historical accuracy. The debate surrounding and fluidity of Norwegian-American identity, combined with a focus on the Centennial and the myths used to construct a defined Norwegian-American identity, are a prevailing narrative throughout Schultz's and Lavoll's books. The claims Schultz and Lavoll make about myths surrounding the Vikings, discovery, and creation of Norwegian-American ethnic identity are similar to those I highlight in Calvin Coolidge's speech and the Centennial Essay Contest. Ethnicity on Parade and The Promise Fulfilled also provide a clear starting point for my analysis. While Schultz and Lavoll do a masterful job at illustrating the connection between the Centennial and building Norwegian-American ethnic identity, they rarely make explicit connections between the construction of this identity to the idea of Nordic whiteness and the becoming of Norwegian-Americans as white Americans. Despite limited explicit references to whiteness, Schultz's and Lavoll's books contain the building blocks for constructing an implicit whiteness, such as mentions of the Vikings and discovery, statements about Norwegian Americans claiming ethnic superiority, and emphasis on Americanization and nativism taking root. By using their research as a starting point, I make explicit the connection between the clearly stated ideas of a constructed Norwegian-American identity and the performance of whiteness. Lastly, while Schultz and Lavoll covered the construction of a Norwegian-American ethnic identity, Ignatieff covers the idea of the Irish becoming a white ethnic identity. The 2021 anthology, Nordic Whiteness and Migration to the USA, highlights the construction of whiteness across migrants from all the Nordic countries, including Norway. By analyzing various myths surrounding Nordic whiteness, this anthology interrogates and clarifies the integration and performance of whiteness and how the boundaries of whiteness among migrants from the Nordic countries are not set in stone. The 6 myths that Nordic whiteness claims contributed to building a white identity concern, first, the representation of Nordic immigration to the US as a peaceful process of settlement on empty American lands. The second myth is about Nordic immigrants as a homogenous group. The third myth deals with the representation of Nordic immigrants as an inherently egalitarian people. The fourth myth has to do with representations of Nordic immigrants as people living in harmony with other groups. The fifth myth has to do with the belief that Nordic immigrants easily assimilated into white American society. The sixth myth is that there were political and ideological mutual understanding between Nordic and the white Anglo-Saxon elite. The editors and various contributors to this anthology deploy these 6 myths to understand, question, and explain the complexities and interconnectedness of whiteness to Nordic communities across the United States. These myths and the debate surrounding them seamlessly fit into the celebration events of the 1925 Centennial and are important steps in performing whiteness. While all 6 of these myths can relate to this presentation, the most important are the first, fifth, and sixth myths, as they are directly connected to the ideas of the Vikings, Leif Erikson and discovery, claims of ethnic superiority, and Americanness. By invoking these myths through their rhetoric and actions, members of the Norwegian-American community appealed to the accepted white American community to legitimize their claim of Norwegian-American identity as a white American identity. In addition, the involvement of members of the white American community, such as President Calvin Coolidge, officiated the acceptance of Norwegian Americans into the official implicit sphere of accepted white Americans. By using the myths from Nordic whiteness in congruence with the creation of a Norwegian American identity and the definition of performing whiteness, I argue that they can apply across the board and allow for analysis of important features absent in previously cited scholarship. The myths from Nordic whiteness function as an example of contemporary discussion of Nordic ethnic identities and a way to read archival material from historical events connected to the construction of Norwegian American identity. By focusing on aspects of these various works, I have reviewed relevant scholarship to connect the ideas of Norwegian American ethnic identity to the performance of whiteness, providing a basis for now analyzing the 1925 Centennial. For the purpose of this presentation, I will limit my analysis to one of the three key themes for my thesis: the Vikings, Leif Erikson, and the discovery of America. Myths surrounding Nordic whiteness and the Vikings were heavily present throughout the Centennial and were featured in speeches from the Norwegian-American community and President Calvin Coolidge. Both of these events, the essay contest and Coolidge's speech, work as a discussion and discourse, as the Norwegian-American community used the Centennial to appeal to the broader white American community, presenting these myths and claiming themselves as white, while members of the accepted white American community, speaking from a position of privilege, legitimized these claims. The 1925 Centennial was advertised as a celebration of the Norwegian-American community and 100 years of migration, and much of the promotional material for the event prominently featured the inclusion of President Coolidge as the keynote speaker. Including Coolidge as a speaker broadened the appeal of the event and helped to attract more people within and outside from the Norwegian-American community to the event. The claims of discovery and references to the Vikings during the Centennial first appear in the foreword by Gisli Bothne, the Centennial president. In his opening remarks, he proclaims that the sloopers are by no means, however, the first Norwegians that are recorded in American history. Pre-Columbian history carries records of their voyages of discovery and colonization. All of this is embraced in the Norse chapter of American history, which will be passed in review at the Centennial celebration. Bothne is setting up the connection between the Norwegian Americans at the 1925 Centennial and the colonial history written in the Icelandic sagas, particularly Grenlandia saga and Eirik saga Røyve. He is setting up myths about Leif Erikson and Vinland as fact rather than fiction, which he and other speakers during the Centennial can later refer back to when discussing 1825 and the first Norwegian colonists to arrive in the Americas. He writes as though Eriksson's expedition was established fact in 1925, although it would be decades until the settlement, Lands av Meros, would be the only historically confirmed Viking settlement in the Americas. On this point, in Search for Forced Contact, Annette Goldoni does not link the settlement with those in the Vinland sagas. Rather, she approaches both through the lens of 19th century European ethnic imagining, such as featured in the essays by Anderson, Norley, and Agid. Goldoni states, clearly, Lansamero was a landing site and a place for repairing ships, but it was not the Vinland where grapes grew wild. Perhaps it is best, therefore, to think of Vinland as what it became for Euro-Americans in the 19th century. That is, as a geographical site that was transfigured into an imagined landscape for the projection of dreams. Understanding the idea of Vinland as a myth built on historical texts is key to Goldoni's argument. The writers of the essay contest and members of the Centennial as a whole use Vinland primarily to pursue their own dreams of becoming white Americans, and as a text they can appropriate for their own myth-making. By connecting the settlers of 1000 with the colonizers of 1825, the idea of Norwegian-American identity as a white identity rooted in colonialism has the basis to become fact, because it implies rightful inhabitation based on the notion of ancient occupation. Similar to Du Bois's definition of whiteness as forever and ever ownership of the earth. One of the most prominent members, and here we have, brief side note, here we have clips from the Norse-American Centennial film reels, where in the beginning they connect Leif Erikson's journey in 1000 and his connection from Nidaros, followed immediately by, it's a very finicky system, there we go, with the Restauration in 1825 and overlapping the two to connect them. One of the most prominent members of Norwegian-American academia in building the Leif Erikson myth was Rasmus B. Anderson. According to the laudatory biography that precedes his Centennial essay, Anderson started his professional career at Albion Academy in Wisconsin and served as the head of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Scandinavian Studies Department. Anderson's most significant contribution to the creation of Norwegian-American identity were his publications. His biography claims that he was the first Norwegian to publish a book in English in America titled America Not Discovered by Columbus. In this work, Anderson proudly claims that Leif Erikson, not Christopher Columbus, discovered America, and that the Vikings should be proclaimed as the true discoverers of America. There we go. In Vikings Across the Atlantic, Daron Olson explores myths about the Vikings and Norwegian identity, both in Norway and in America. He begins with Rudolf Kaiser and P.E. Munch, two early Norwegian history professors based in Norway, before discussing Anderson's contribution. As professor at the University of Wisconsin, Anderson was familiar with the Norwegian school and adopted the glorification of the Viking Age to serve as the cornerstone of his synthetic ideology. To the ideas of Kaiser and Munch, he added an American component to the story by promoting Leif Erikson as both a Norwegian and an American hero. His most inventive concept was the idea that American values owed their origins to the activities of the Norwegians. For the Norwegian historians, the American connection was virtually non-existent. Anderson undertook the task of connecting the myths of Leif Erikson to both Norwegian and American identities to the Norwegian-American community, and claimed this connection as the cornerstone of American democracy and freedom. Based upon these foundational texts and his position as a major influencer within the Norwegian-American community, Anderson's contributions and inclusion to the Centennial essay collection make sense. Because of his writings and due to his position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Anderson's myth about Vikings and the discovery of America entered public consciousness and helped to legitimize Norwegian-American identity as a white American, historically transcendent immigrant identity. In building up this mythos, Anderson helped lay the foundation for Norwegian Americans to be recognized as officially and equally white Americans, an identity which came to the forefront during the Centennial. In my introduction, I mentioned that there were few uses of the term white during the Centennial, yet Anderson's essay is one exception to this general trend of whiteness as race remaining implicit. While Anderson's essay is not long, only about half a page, it is filled with historical myths and identity-building narratives, similar to his previous works. He starts his essay by highlighting the intertwinedness of the Restauration in America, specifically mentioning the importance of the day the ship departed Norway, July 4th, 1852. He follows this appeal with high praise to the Vikings and colonization. The civilized history of America begins with the Norsemen. They were the first to venture out of sight of land in ships. They were the discoverers of pelagic navigation. The first white man to plant his feet on the American continent was Leif Erikson in the year 1000. The first white man who founded a settlement in America was Thorfinn Karlsefni in the year 1007. The first white woman who came to this country was Thorfinn's talented and enterprising wife, Gudrid. In the year 1008, she gave birth to a son in Vinland. The boy was called Snorre, and he was the first person of European descent to first see the light of day in the New World. Acknowledgement and praise of Viking colonization is central to Anderson's Centennial essay. He reintroduces myth-making ideas from his previous writings that function to legitimize the idea of Norwegian-American identity as a white colonial identity. Starting with the phrase, the civilized history of America, Anderson sets up the importance of both the Centennial and of Norwegian Americans in America as a people who managed to matter for close to 1,000 years of history, despite having only arrived in the US 100 years prior to this celebration. This line has dual purpose, for both explicitly arguing that the Vikings were the first to colonize the Americas, and for giving Norwegian Americans mythos to claim their own identity as justified colonists, or being the first to discover and settle the land. It also refuses to acknowledge or legitimize indigenous sovereignty or existence in the Americas prior to colonization. This concept is clearly illustrated in Christopher Crocker's article, What We Talk About When We Talk About Vinland, where he dissects the claims of firstness and discovery in congruence with indigenous erasure. In his article, Crocker states, the supposed early Norse presence in what became America was primarily interpreted by American historians during this time in the context of and in order to uphold established discovery myths. By positioning the early Norse settlers as white ancestors of present-day Anglo-Americans, their brief occupation was seen as a precursor to the eventual so-called manifest destiny of European colonial expansion. Through the claims of discovery, historians such as Anderson could limit and erase contact with the indigenous population while simultaneously connecting Northern European migrants, like Norwegian Americans, with the history of America. In order to claim historicity between the Vikings and Norwegian Americans, Anderson must establish a link between the myths of discovery and firstness. To Anderson, the Vikings were the first worthy To Anderson, the Vikings were the first worthy ethnic group in America, and he uses vivid language to prop up these myths. He follows up the first line by referring to the Vikings as the first to venture out of sight of land and the discoverers of pelagic navigation. These references to firstness and discovery are used to mythologize the Vikings and enhance Anderson's claim on a white identity marker. By claiming these titles, Anderson is proclaiming the Vikings, and thus Norwegian-Americans, as early proponents of colonization. In the last segment of Anderson's quote, he ties the ideas of the Vikings and colonization with whiteness, as he claims Leif Erikson and Gudrid were the first white man and woman to step foot in America. This is one of the very few instances throughout the essay contest where the term white is explicitly stated. The direct reference to whiteness is important as it helps Anderson to build his historical argument. By adding the word white in front of Leif Erikson and Gudrid, Anderson ahistoricizes the historical roots to allow legitimacy for the claim of Norwegian Americans to the myths of firstness and discovery of the Vikings. Because of Anderson's perceived connection of Norwegian American identity to the myths of firstness and discovery of the Vikings, they are, to Anderson, legitimate white Americans. In addition to this explicit mention of whiteness, Anderson also argues that without the early works of discovery, settlement, and conquest by the Vikings, the future nations of Europe would not have been able to become colonizing entities in the New World. This phrase, which refers to the continent currently known as America, refers back to the ideas of firstness and discovery, either by the Vikings or Columbus, and it simultaneously invokes a history of colonization and indigenous erasure. Although these ideas were popular in 1925 and are still used outside of academic context, when reading the Vinland sagas, both the idea of discovery and colonization fall apart. In A Global Race in the European Imaginary, Geraldine Heng writes about first contact and colonization in the Vinland sagas. She argues that there was contact between the Viking settlers and the indigenous populations, and that the Viking settlers chose to leave Vinland after failing in their attempt to become colonists. Heng writes, both the Vinland sagas and the historical record suggest in their own way that the native North Americans of the continent were more than a match for the Northern European would-be colonists of Vinland. According to Heng's analysis of the Vinland sagas, there are both numerous instances of first contact, and it is clear that the Vikings wanted to colonize the New World, yet were not able to because of the strength of the indigenous population. This interpretation refutes important aspects of the myths surrounding the Vikings that Anderson proposes, as he does not reference first contact with the indigenous populations, instead using the terms discovery and the New World. In addition, the Vikings and Leif Erikson are referred to as colonizers, or that they have colonized the land. According to Heng, and as evidenced by the lack of permanent settlements after the Icelandic sagas, the Vikings are not colonists, but rather would-be colonists who choose to abandon Vinland and return to Europe rather than elicit further conflict. Both of these points work to dispel the myth of the Vikings and discovery as perpetuated by Anderson and other members in the 1925 Centennial. Anderson was an important figurehead in the Norwegian-American academic community, and while he founded the myths of the Vikings and discovery, his essay is not alone in portraying these myths. Professor Olaf Morgan-Norli of Luther College submitted his essay, Why We Celebrate, to the contest, receiving second place. Norli sought to directly answer the question posed by the Centennial Committee. While there is no grand biographical introduction like there is for Anderson's essay, Norli includes similar themes, bolstering the accolades of the Norwegian-American community through invoking various myths of Nordic whiteness. Much of Norli's myth building invokes the history of the Vikings and their supposed colonization, as he proudly proclaims. The history of the Norwegians begins with the Viking Age, and during the Viking Age, which lasted 300 years, from 1800 to 1100 AD, the Norwegians were the most important and influential people in Europe. They established colonies to the east, the south, and the west. Norway did not keep these far-flung colonies as a colonial empire, but gave them to the nations of Europe. And wherever Norwegian colonists have gotten a footing, there they have practiced what they learned of old Mother Norway. The breath of life, which the Vikings infused in history, lives today in Norway, England, and in America. Norway proclaims the influences of the Vikings on the future, how their history of discovery and conquest led to the future expansions of European colonialism. This appeal to a mythic past seeks to establish a connection between the Norwegian-American community in 1925 and the Vikings in the early 11th century by means of the Norse history of discovery and exploration. By starting with the phrase, the history of the Norwegians began with the Viking Age, Norley is proclaiming that contemporary Norwegians in 1925, and by extension Norwegian Americans, are the immediate descendants of the Vikings and their claims to discovery. Yet Norley also adds a layer of deniability to this colonialism, adding that while the Vikings were the most influential discoverers, they did not hold on to their colonial conquests and allow the other European nations to stake a claim in colonization. By connecting Norwegian-American identity to that of a Viking history, Norley uses the contemporary that the Vikings were white to further the idea of Norwegian Americans as white Americans, while simultaneously distancing Norwegian Americans from the forced displacement of colonization after Columbus. He ends this section by calling back to this idea, stating that the energy of the Vikings is embedded into the ideas and history of Norway, England, and America. The ending line summarizes the entire argument surrounding the Vikings, that according to Norley, the people of Norway, England, and America are inextricably linked together and function as being practically the same in terms of status, thereby cementing the claims of Norwegian Americans on whiteness. Myths surrounding the Vikings, Leif Erikson, and discovery were important to the Norwegian American presenters at the Centennial, and these claims are also prevalent in President Calvin Coolidge's speech. By including similar myths to those featured throughout the essay contest, Coolidge confirms and legitimizes the other men's claims on the accepted white American community. In his speech, Coolidge proclaims, "These Norsemen whose beginnings in the United States we have celebrated here exercised a great influence upon our modern history and Western civilization. Leif, the son of Eric, near 500 years before Columbus, appeared to have found the New World." Coolidge plays on similar myths to those within the Norwegian community, specifically referring to Norwegian Americans as Norsemen, and repeating the myth of Leif Erikson discovering America. Coolidge provides support to the claims of Norwegian Americans as Americans, and he invokes the same myths as Anderson and Norley in order to affirm their connection to the Vikings, firstness, and discovery. Coolidge follows up this first reference to Leif Erikson, Columbus, and the New World by stating, "These sons of Thor and Odin and the great free North shaped themselves in the mind's eye as very princes of high and hardy adventure. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland to the mainland, step by step they worked their way across the North Atlantic. One wonders whither these Northmen would turn for adventure if the earth should ever be so completely charted that exploration offered no more challenges." In this quote, Coolidge continues the claims on discovery and the Vikings, even going so far as to label the Norwegian American community as descending from the Norse gods. He lays out the path from Norway to Iceland and Greenland, yet does not use the term American, instead the mainland and the North Atlantic. These specific word choices are important as they emphasize the importance of crossing and discovery in order to build a connection to America during 1925. Importantly, as I've already stated, there was no definitive archaeological evidence for the Vikings in America at the time of the Centennial. Through these praises and by invoking the same language as the essay contest authors, Coolidge affirms them as truths, also held by the accepted white American community, thereby providing a legitimate claim that Norwegian Americans, through their Viking ancestors, discovered America. The myths of Leif Erikson, the settlement of Vinland, and the discovery of America were a constant mythologizing force throughout the Centennial to proclaim Norwegian Americans as having a legitimate claim to becoming true Americans. The establishment of a Norwegian American identity in the decades after the 1925 Centennial by means of the keynote speech by Calvin Coolidge and the works of Rasmus B. Anderson and Olaf Norley still impact the current understanding of a Norwegian American identity in the commemoration of 200 years. For example, a week after presenting my research to Queen Sonja, I attended the NAHA board meeting with my poster, where various members could come up and ask questions about my research. One of the members got upset as the poster mentioned whiteness, and he would not condone Norwegian American identity having any connection with whiteness. Additionally, when I presented an early version of this talk a month and a half ago to the Daughters of Norway in Tacoma, one of the audience members became visibly upset and commented that this was not whiteness, but heritage. These examples highlight the positive attachment people can have to what it means to be Norwegian-American and intrinsically connecting these ideas to identity. While there are many Norwegian Americans who don't want to think about the connections between Norwegian descendants and whiteness, white privilege, and white supremacy, pointing it out and discussing what it means to be a member of this identity is important and an absolute necessity for commemorating the 2025 Bicentennial. For example, by using the Vikings as a descriptor for Norwegian American characteristics, they are repeating the idea brought into being in the 1920s rather than a long-term, continuous ethnic association. In this plenary talk, I have highlighted one of the three themes for my thesis and how the 1925 Norse-American Centennial displays a performativity of whiteness. In order to overcome and push back against these myths of the 1925 Centennial and ignorance concerning the performance of whiteness, we, the presenters, attendees, and Norwegian American community members at Crossings and Connections must actively discuss, engage, and fight against the often obscured and implicit nature of white supremacy and white privilege that has become entangled with Norwegian American identity. Thank you.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, do we have any questions for Eric? I think I saw this hand first, and then I'll get to you. It's my workout for today. Why don't you please identify yourself, too?
Sure. Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Hans Petter Grav, and I've also written on the topic. I was in one of the books that you cited. And I was wondering, were you surprised with the 1925 Centennial that there was so little explicit mention of whiteness? And how did you reflect on it, that it's just a tacit kind of thing? That what do you think are the reasons why it seems to be like it's there, but it's not talked about?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. As a Centennial, it was really celebrating the Dispacement, 100 years of migration. And one of the goals of white supremacy is to say this obscured, invisible glue of we have this privilege in white supremacy, but we don't talk about it. But it's also there, especially before the time with Madison Grant, the passing of the Great Race, and really these claims of white superiority that we see. One of the explicit mentions that I was not able to include in this presentation was Olaf College book, which he writes after the Centennial based on his essay, History of the Norwegian People in America, where he claims that Norwegian Americans are the fairest of the white races, which is quite the claim. But yes, I think a long roundabout way to attempt to answer the question.
Hi there. Thank you, Eric. I'm Leanne Potter. I work at the Library of Congress, where some of Calvin Coolidge's papers are located. And I am curious, in your research in the archives here, did you come across anything that would suggest that who actually wrote Coolidge's speech?
Ooh, that's a great question. That I don't know about. I don't know exactly if he wrote it or if he had aides write it, but I know that in the months before Coolidge came to the Centennial, he was in correspondence a lot with Congressman O.J. Kvale or Senator Peter Norbeck. So we had these connections in the Norwegian American community that were providing a lot of the support of his ideas and thoughts about Norwegian American identity. Yes, I'll take this one quick. The other two themes I talk about so the three themes in my thesis are the Vikings, life ethics, and discovery of America, claims of Norwegian-American ethnic superiority, and this prevailing and constant Americanness.
Excellent talk. Anthony Baptista, St. Olaf College. So just randomly recently, I was reading some of Ralph Waldo Emerson's writing, and he has this great moment where he's talking about the Norwegians, and he says how wonderful and kind and democratic and all these kinds of things they are, and then you turn the page and he says, except for all of the murder. They are just a violent people who, if they get bored, just start stabbing each other. So I was amused by this because I was reading it here at St. Olaf in the comfort of a chair with a coffee in front of me. But imagined the attempt to respond to this, 50, 60 years later, as you're trying to reconstruct an identity with certain kinds of myths and legends going the other direction. So I'm wondering if that kind of acknowledgement either sharpens or lessens the impact of the Norwegian claim to whiteness. By that I mean, is an attempt here to claim whiteness to kind of claw your way up from a lower position by using the same kind of tools that have been used against you in the creation of these myths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really in 1925 and this war period, it's the Norwegian-American community becoming a more whiter white, or becoming the fairest of the white races, of having this claim to white privilege and white supremacy that we see with the accepted white American community of those coming from the Mayflower. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for maybe one or two. I'm going to give Ruth here, because you already had one, but we'll try to get you both in.
So, Ruth Hemstad, thank you for this interesting talk. I think I've been writing and studying a bit on Leif Erikson and Rasmus Andersson lately, and I think this idea of Leif Erikson's whiteness is quite clear and explicitly stated from the beginning, from his 1874 and 75 speeches. And he's also building on Christian Ravn's sourced editions from 1837. And I think, and also this performance, which really was under the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1993, also promoted this Viking image and very physically also with this Viking ship expedition. But I think by 1925, the scholarly support of this, you called it a myth, but it was not necessarily only a myth, it was scholarly accepted as a fact that based on the Vineland sagas, that there has been Viking exploration or discovery or visits to Vinland, but the exact location of it was, of course, unknown. Mm-hmm. And the first idea was this was around New England and Massachusetts, and how long they stayed is also a much more disputed issue. But I don't think it's and it's not necessarily interesting if it was only a myth or a fact. But I think it was widespread acceptance of that this was based on historical sources. So it was not only it was a productive historical narrative, but it was in some way based on sources that was discussed with very many scholars, both from Norwegian American, Swedish American, Danish American, and American scholars as well. So, but your main point is very clear that this is a way of promoting Norwegian American position on the top, along with the Anglo-Saxon in this racial ethnic hierarchy in US at the time. So thank you.
Just with respect to that slide that you have there, Norse flag, was that actually stated that way in the source you got it from?
Yeah, in the Centennial reels, they say the Norse flag, not Norwegian flag.
Right, because it's pretty clear it is.
Yeah. Yep.
We're getting close to the end of time. If somebody has a very short, pithy question that you can state in maybe one sentence. I know I can't. But I like to talk a lot myself. So anybody else? Okay, well, why don't we give another hand to Eric? Well done.